I'm sitting here with the great Adam Glasser, originally from South Africa. He has been living in the UK for many, many years. He's a wonderful human being. We've done some projects together. I met him in South Africa many years ago, and moreover, he's a great pianist and harmonica player. Adam, thanks for being on the show.
It's a complete delight to be here, Mike. I'm honored.
How have you been?
I've been good. Yes, we were just saying it's been where we met in Grahamstown, now Makanda, in 2014, and I always remember the very first time you had a workshop. I didn't know who you were, and I heard these incredible Brazilian songs reharmonized with Mike Del Ferro magic. And that remains the first thing. And then, of course, I should explain to anyone listening that the second reason that I know you is because I discovered an incredible recording called Make Someone Happy, which you arranged, and it was the first recording you did with Toots Thielemans. And I am forever in love with that track. I think it's amazing. I showed to my students the great chords you put in. And then during lockdown, I think I contacted you and you kindly talked about that for a podcast I was doing. So I'm happy to renvoyer l'ascenseur, as they say.
Thank you so much. That's so kind. Yeah, I remember this very well, this podcast, because you're very active in the, let's say, British harmonica scene.
Yes, well, there's a handful of us in the UK playing jazz on the chromatic. And so before young people come up, there's always new kids on the block. But as you know, I'm a member of Harmonica UK, which is a national organization, and I'm actually a patron of it. And so I run chromatic workshops. I know very little about the blues, and I don't try to pretend to know about the blues, but chromatic harmonica is my thing.
Yeah, I think the blues is great, but we are more into harmony, more complicated harmony, right?
Yes, and also there's a tradition of playing standards on the chromatic, which makes it a frontline instrument. And there are people who play standards with note bending and playing different keys on the blues, but the genre, I suppose, that I'm attached to is jazz, Brazilian music, modern jazz harmony, playing those kind of lines. And of course, as you know, I'm a pianist, and I always think of the piano when I'm playing. I came late to the harmonica. I actually had a harmonica given to me by my dad when I was 17 years old. And it was too difficult to play. I stuck it in a drawer for 10 years, 4 octaves. Now, most people, chromatic players you work with, I'm sure, play 3 octaves, but 4 is too many notes. And then I was on a cruise in 1983. We were backing a very good sort of cabaret harmonica player. And his name was Harry Rowley, a British guy. We were working on the ship out of Miami. And I had this harmonica, and I said, "Hey, Harry, I've got a chromatic. I think there's something wrong with it." And I went like that. He said, "Hey, just give me your harmonica." And he went, and I realized I was blowing too hard and in the wrong way. And when I came back from that cruise, I'd heard Stevie Wonder playing Isn't She Lovely? Everybody knew about that. But there's an amazing album called Eve It's Red Now, where Stevie covers a whole lot of Burt Bacharach tunes instrumentally. And that's the famous version of Alfie. It comes from that. So that's also another thing which got me into the chromatic harmonica.
Yeah. And this was all back in South Africa where you grew up.
Well, this was actually England-based, because although I grew up in South Africa, I came here when I was 18, 19, and I've been based here ever since, apart from going back there and living there in between for a short time. But as a musician, I came late to music. I did an English degree at Warwick University, messed around with jazz, and it's only when I was in my mid-20s that I started taking jazz piano seriously and tried to do gigs and so on. And then only in my late 20s that I actually started taking the harmonica seriously. So I'm quite a late starter.
Yeah, but you don't hear that.
Well, the thing is, if you do a lot of work, you can catch up. It's like a hare and tortoise thing, you know.
Yeah,
And you have to
yeah,
just do what you can do. That's what we all do.
yeah. And back to Toots Thielemans, I interview many harmonica players, and my question always, I actually have a couple of questions. The first one is, how did you discover the harmonica? You already said something about that. And then, how has Toots influenced your playing? And the third question, even more important, how do you find your own way playing the harmonica with Toots being so dominant with the harmonica?
Mike, these are great questions. I think I answered the first one about how I got the harmonica, and it was Stevie Wonder that lit the spark. But Toots has always just been there for me as a jazz musician. I've kind of known him. I've sort of listened to him. I can't remember a time when I discovered him. I keep discovering new recordings. Somebody sent me an album which he'd recorded in Japan with the pianist Mulgrew Miller. And it's a weird recording because some of the tracks are just Toots playing alone. And
Really?
yeah, I'll send you the link. It's called, I'll find it out. But somebody in our harmonica organization said, "Oh, you must listen to this." And I thought, oh yeah, I've listened to most of Toots's albums. I know them. But this I'd never heard. And it's one of these albums where I'm sure they got him in the studio. They had him for a short time. The guys were available. I mean, I think it's like Rufus Reid on bass or Ray Drummond or somebody like that. And the amazing thing is that you hear him playing Round Midnight unaccompanied with the full arrangement. You know that line that goes, he does that, but he does it in the key of F minor. So, because it's not in E flat, which is what it normally is, that famous Round Midnight of Miles Davis. And then he does some other standards where he's just playing to a click. And I thought, I'm sure I can't understand. I'd love to ask someone about that. Anyway, just to come back to your question, because I'll get carried away.
No, but this is an amazing story, actually. So, because I've worked with him for so many years, but I also keep discovering things. So it's great to hear this.
Yes. Well, the thing is, Toots, this comes to answer your final question, because how do you find your own thing? Because so many people find it impossible not to imitate Toots.
Right.
And I think that, anybody who is playing any of my, I would say contemporaries, people my age, and I'm 69 now, but also younger players, the people that are on the map, Gregoire Marais, Yvonne Prenet, Hermine Dulo, who you play with a lot, marvelous players. I think we've all struggled with this, not a struggle, because I think it's an issue how much you sound like Toots. And it's kind of, all I would say is this, is that I've got a certain sound that I want to hear in my head, and it's not like Toots. And I hope that, people listening to my albums, I think they'll recognize that I have made a choice at the karmic soul level. Because that's the other thing, is that I don't believe in going to, listening to a play and say, oh man, he sounds too much like Toots. I kind of say, that's cool. That's cool. If you are referencing Toots, or it's part of your style, it's like I'm looking at the best things that people do when they play. And so if there are influences which previously I might actually, and I have to admit this, when I was young, I was super critical, because my dad was a professor of music at Goldsmiths College here, and he was super critical. And so it's taken me a long time to develop almost like a conceptual freedom to kind of live and let live. And I just think I'm glad that I have my own path. And my own path, as you might hear, is to do with South African jazz and sounding, exploring sounding like a South African horn player on the harmonica. And I don't know any other chromatic players that have gone down this path. And the other thing is that I'm just really keen to play on changes and to play in any key. So I'll go along, and I'm very few people have attempted, I mean, snow peas, it's thereby hangs a tale, because Toots' solo on that with Bill Evans on Affinity is unbelievable.
Yeah.
It's just like, it's so spontaneous, it's so natural, and you can't imitate Toots. It's like, forget it. Because he's so inventive. I'm telling you, and you've done 150 gigs with him, Mike, but I'm saying from a harmonica player's point of view, it's a dead end for me to try and imitate Toots or Stevie Wonder. And I just feel like I've tried to develop my own thing. And people can like it or not. I don't have that kind of magical fluency that Toots has, or the sound. That's the other thing, is that this album that I was referring to, you hear him playing nakedly his sound, and it's like a holy sound. It's like, the very top musicians like Coltrane, like Wayne Shorter, like Miles. You hear that sound and you just think, man, okay, I almost like just enjoy it, because you're never going to sound like that.
Yeah.
So and then also, if you do sound like that a bit, and we all learn by imitation. So I think it's kind of cool. It's cool. I'm very much live and let live.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoy my podcast, then please subscribe, leave a rating and a review. Please visit my website, mikedelferro.com, where you also will find links to my other podcast, Self-Management for Musicians. You will also find links to my music and my socials. And of course, please share this podcast with anyone interested. Nothing beats the word of mouth. Thank you. Speaking of the sound of Toots, I remember that when we played, like here and there were like local harmonica players, and he always invited them to play a song or whatever. And then, and there were so many great people. People are actually known now and there, and unknown people. But I mean, not at every concert, but he used to do that, And it's true that they played something, it all sounded beautiful, sounded great, and then he played one note, not even intentionally, but he just played it, and then the sound was like from another world. I must admit that.
Yeah. And you have to live with that. If you're a harmonica player, you have to live with it, that you may end up on a stage with him, or you may end up on a playlist with him, and it doesn't matter if you know nothing about music, but it's the soul energy, which, it's extraordinary. His phrasing and his sound is just extraordinary. It's yeah.
And what I also remember was he never, he would repeat himself in the themes, especially when he was a little bit older. He would play the same repertory, the same basic arrangements. Was once he started improvising, it was always fresh.
Yes.
Yeah.
But Mike, I'll tell you something else, that when I was young, I used to listen to Toots, and I used to say, I wish he'd play this tune. I wish he'd do this. I wish he'd do that. Why don't you do this? And you can't say that. You can't go to Miles and say, hey, Miles, I got a request. I want you to play this. It's like, this is where I feel like my heart has to open to every musician and let them be, and then open to myself, because I'd tell you who's just visited us here in London is Matthias Heiser. incredible Danish harmonica player who, when we did the Brussels gig
Yes.
a couple of years ago, I missed him. I don't know if you heard him, Mike, after our gig. But for the listeners, I did this gig. Mike invited me to Brussels in May of 2022, and we did this tribute to Toots with this wonderful trio. And Matthias was coming along with his band to do one of these things where you do the entire album, every tune
Yes,
on
he
the
did
album.
Affinity, right?
Infinity. And I know his dad because Matthias and his dad, Ole, who's also a wonderful guy, they came and stayed here about 5 or 6 years ago at my place. And I said to him, I want you to record. I've never heard another harmonica player play a Snow-Peas, ridiculously difficult chord changes. And I wish, I'll tell you in a moment how I met Toots and interviewed him and then did a film with him. But I wish I had asked him about that recording. I wish I'd been aware of it. But I got to know that tune because in 2011, October, Pino Palladino, the bass player, invited me to do a gig at Ronnie Scott's with him and a whole bunch of other people, incredible musicians. Chris Dave on drums, James Poyser on keyboards, a horn section. And it was Pino and guests. And he asked me to learn this tune. And I had 6 days, and it was a nightmare. It was an absolute nightmare. And the gig is on YouTube somewhere. But Pino did a brilliant thing, Mike, which is kind of fascinating to me, which is that he knew I was struggling a bit with the changes, and he counted it in super slow. It was it was that slow. And I just went, what a brilliant piece. And so it was he made it easy for me to nail it. And since then, I've been playing that tune all the time. It's been I constantly practice it. It's like giant steps or
It's
any
like
tune which you
like
just
a lifetime exercise.
That's exactly
Yeah, that's beautiful. But you really found your own voice on the harmonica, like I said before, especially blended with your South African heritage.
Yes. I guess I'm glad it makes me happy when people hear that, because I grew up in Johannesburg listening to South African horn players and also voices. I mean, the sound of South African harmony derives mainly from this wonderful mixture of traditional music, ethnic music, local music from Pedi, Xhosa, Zulu, Venda, Khoisan, Abdullah Ibrahim, very influenced by the Khoi in the south. So there's a huge melting pot, and it gives the music such incredible depth and identity. And my dad grew up, he was involved in this musical King Kong you may have heard of, which is not about the monster, but it was the first black musical in South Africa. And he worked with all these jazz musicians and a fantastic cast of 70. And it came to London, the show. It was like a jazz show, songs composed by Todd Machakiza. My dad was really involved in the arrangement. So the sound of jazz has just been with me forever. And I always felt, I'll never be a musician. And my dad dissuaded me because I never did grades. I couldn't sight read. He lived apart from me from when I was 7. And I never had a proper musical training. I learned to play by doing gigs, functions, and weddings. But gradually, I kind of reconnected with that late, and so I worked with a lot of South African musicians, and I feel like the sound was in me, and I want to hear that sound. I want to hear that sound, and combined with the fact that they're brilliant South African musicians that can shred on any changes. So this combination of the sound, the basic South African 3-chord sequence, which is just that. That kind of sound.
It's great.
There's a million tunes on that. And also, there are albums like the Blues in Chicago, which never did stray from the blues. And so those guys who play on that, through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, they've informed that with such depth. Players like Bani Ratchabani, plays bands that most people haven't heard of, like The Drive. When you hear these guys playing, it knocks me out in the same way that the extreme blues players will knock people out that love blues, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
That's super. There's some people like, I just want to hear the blues. And the world, the blues is deep enough to be the entire world for those people. And I say mazel tov, good luck. And that's wonderful,
And the same goes for South African music.
Yeah. And so it's kind of weird, because what did you grow up listening to? And there's an interesting dynamic amongst young South African musicians where they're saying, I don't want to be saddled with sounding South African, whatever that means, inverted commas. So I think that's really interesting. And then there are people that mix it. There are people like Zim Ngqawana who sound unbelievably South African. I mean, he's like, to me, he's at the level of Coltrane. You talk about sound. And then there are other amazing players like Vuma Levin, who spent 5 years in Holland, I think, at the Institute, whose music is super developed. But the average listener wouldn't say, oh, that sounds South African. And he's not bothered. He's just doing his own thing. And again, I say mazel tov, my hat off to someone that can do that.
But don't you find it a pity that the young generation of South African musicians want to move away from their tradition?
Mike, I would say that there are lots of young South African musicians. From what I was back in South Africa in September to launch my this latest album I've done, and the music I hear there's got everything, and so there are people that are doing stuff which is not related to the South African tradition, and there are people that are using it in a million different ways. So I don't think it's possible to generalize about it. You still get young players that have got the most incredible groove and vibe, which is so South African. For example, and there are also guys that are like in the spirit of the Blue Notes, doing like really weird, free improvised stuff. It's fascinating. I suppose I don't get back to South Africa as much as I'd like, and so I'm always kind of hungry for that.
I remember this free jazz player. His name was Zim, with complicated surname, who had this farm just outside of Johannesburg.
That's right. That's who I mentioned. Zim Ngqawana, NGQ Ngqawana. He had a quartet with Andile Yanana, and that quartet was super Coltrane influenced. So you heard South African tunes. If you go on Spotify or YouTube or you'll hear the range of his music. And he played flute. He plays like traditional standards as well. He plays many 3-chord standards, and he's a storyteller as well, in the same way that Coltrane was a storyteller. And he's got a sound which is incredible, and a huge body of his repertoire is like super free, like as angry and passionate and crazy as any. And he spent time in the US. I'm not fully aware. I mean, I discovered him relatively late. And actually, we met, Zim and I, because he came to a gig of mine in Pretoria in 2010. And we were going to do some recording together, and then he died, like in very young, like in 2011, May 2011. But he's left this incredible legacy. There's,
he was a visionary.
Yeah. But kind of not an easy character. The pianist Kyle Shepard worked with him, and he had his farm that you refer to. He had it vandalized. It was destroyed by people that were upset with him for some reason, and I wasn't sure why. But there is a video where he and Kyle Shepard went and spent the entire day playing this wrecked piano and the wreckage. And they did a kind of free avant-garde improvisation to heal the fact that his music had, his place. I mean, he had, had people coming to study there, and, there were many people hugely influenced by Zim.
Has this been recorded, this thing with Kyle Shepard?
Yes, it was a video. I mean,
So it's on YouTube.
I saw it in 2010. I'm not sure if it's on YouTube, but I remember seeing it shortly after it had been made. His partner Zaida Harmonica would know what's happened to that, but it's pretty intense. It's like the outer edges of free jazz, and the occasion of doing it. But it's kind of a brilliant idea. They smashed up a grand piano into pieces, and so Kyle plays literally sounds on the grand piano, like tapping stuff and plucking at the strings, and Zim's walking around playing his soprano sax. I only saw it once, like 14 years ago, but it's just in my imagination, it left a real mark.
No, you just mentioned that you recorded an album a couple of months ago. That's also the reason you kind of wanted to postpone the recording of this podcast in order to talk about your new album.
Yes. Well, I've made only 3 albums in my own name. The first one was called Free at First, and it's a mixture of jazz standards, Brazilian tunes, original compositions, and South African covers. And to my utter astonishment, it won a Sama Award, Best Jazz Album in 2010. So I thought, I'll make another album quite soon afterwards, a few years later, called Mzansi, which was entirely South African tunes. And then I've had a long period where I don't know why, but I didn't do anything. But then about 7 years ago, the pianist Bokani Dyer, do you know him?
Yes, very well.
He came over with his trio, and I've been working here with a young guitarist called Rob Luft, who's now super well established. We're talking, quite a long time ago, and Rob has like made albums with ECM and toured with, some top musicians. But I basically got together in a studio with Bokani and his trio, which was a South African bass player, Romy Brouterseth, and the drummer Spelelo Mazibuko, and Rob. And we recorded a whole bunch of tracks, which were covers of tunes that I always wanted to play. For example, Jimmy Dludlu, fantastic South African guitarist. He's got a tune called Motherland. I love that tune. So I wanted to represent some South African jazz standards on harmonica that I thought, people should hear this tune again. It deserves to be. So that's just what this album consists of, that session. And then I also have, I did another session, which is of some local musicians, which was Rob Luft again, but this time with the British rhythm section. And then last April, I was in Johannesburg, and I recorded a couple of tracks with Becky Koza and Fana Zulu, who's an incredible bass player, played with Hugh Masekela and played on my first album. So the album, I mean, I could yak about it for a long time, but it's these few sessions which were recorded over 7 years and which has now been released on Gallo Records. They did a digital release in August. And it's called Adam Glasser, South Africa and Beyond. And the Beyond part includes 2 tracks which are not South African. One is by Donald Harrison, called The Sandcastle Headhunter. Crazy head. Again, but I met Donald I was actually at Berkeley with him in 1981. We didn't know each other then. And he was in the stratosphere, and I was just like learning how many sharps there were in the key of E. But he was there with Jeff Tain Watts and Terence Blanchard and all these guys who are slightly younger than me, crazily enough. Not much, but slightly. Anyway, Donald came and played at the 2013 Joy of Jazz Festival. And we were in the same, I was invited to play with my band, and I brought out some guys from here, and then also including Unduduzo Makatini, who's now like megastar. Anyway, we did this gig, but Donald was a very generous educator kind of guy, and he got people to sit in with him and play with him, and it was very exciting because he's a real character. And so I sat in with him, and I also met another player called Luanda Gogwana, who you may have come across, a great trumpeter. Anyway, so they played this tune called the Sandcastle Headhunter, and I couldn't make head or tail of it. And so that's another tune it's taken me years to learn on the harmonica, but I wanted to do a harmonica version out of tribute to him.
I think Donald Harrison is kind of underrated.
Hugely. I mean, he's got, just think Art Blakey, the Jazz Messengers.
Exactly.
His own history is so in American tradition, and he's got his own thing. He's got this kind of modern sound, and also he's got this Cajun, he comes New Orleans Cajun kind of marching band vibe, and he plays bongos, he plays percussion congas. He's a very charismatic. He's more than just a sax player, like a community music leader, and I imagine that it must be fabulous to be in his band permanently. It's such an education.
You have a website, right?
I do. It doesn't have a lot on it, and my Instagram, Adam G Harmonica, is probably more up to date.
You collaborated with Joe Zawinul. You once told me the story.
Yes, it's crazy, Mike. I've had these strange musical adventures with people that I never dreamed I would meet, let alone play with. So, shall I tell you the Joe Zawinul story?
Yeah, please share.
I was in the in the mid-90s. I was the pianist, sort of musical director for a South African group called the Manhattan Brothers, and they were in their 80s. They had been living in South Africa and moved here with the musical King Kong that I referred to. And in South Africa, they were household names. And then they'd retired, but they had a brief kind of later life. They got together for Nelson Mandela's concert in 93. They reformed to, when Mandela came out of prison, they reformed. It was 1990. So my dad knew them, and my dad had worked with them in this musical, and he said, "Oh, there's Adam. He can be your accompanist." So terrified, I went and started playing all these grooves, and they're all tunes like when you kumbombela, when you kekuseni, amadoda twele mitwalo, beduta bafane kuseni. Those kind of 3-chord things. I wasn't singing, but I learned the lyrics because I kind of liked them. And then so you had this kind of groove which goes like. That kind of groove. And so anyway, we never did like major commercial gigs, but we did lots of functions, and we did stuff at the High Commission, and we'd be doing stuff for ANC benefits and so on. And then somehow Joe Zawinul contacted the South African High Commission and said he wants to work with some South African musicians. And so the leader of the Manhattan Brothers, Joe Mogotsi, he rang me up and he said, "Hey, Adam, there's this guy, Joe Zoom. He wants to do some gig with us in Vienna." I said, "Joe Zawinul." He said, "Yeah, that's it." And I couldn't believe my ears. So,
wow.
So he had heard a tape that we'd done, which I had actually put together a band, and we'd done a little demo at a recording studio here, and it caught his interest. And at the time, he was like a goodwill ambassador, and a friend of the Viennese prime minister. So they were doing some function, and so it was to do with South Africa. And so they said, "You guys come and play in Vienna." So they said Joe Zawinul's syndicate was coming to Ronnie Scott's, and he said he would record. He would meet us, and I assumed they're not going to need me. I mean, Joe Zawinul can play anything. But we went to Ronnie Scott's to rehearse with him in the afternoon, and he said to me, "You're the pianist for this?" And I sort of said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, show me some of this stuff." So I played. We did a few tunes with the rhythm section, which was like Victor Bailey, Kirk Covington, Gary Poulson, and Manolo Badrena, and it was just I can't believe I'm in the same room as these people. And then Joe said, "You have to come to Vienna with us because I don't know these tunes." And so I thought, "Oh, okay." And he said, "What we'll do, we'll just set up 2 keyboards, and then you lead the tunes, and we'll kind of groove," because there wasn't really time to write arrangements and rehearse and that. And I did write some stuff out for him, but he wasn't that. He wasn't that. There wasn't time really to get it together. Anyway, so we went to Vienna and we did these 2 gigs with him, and it was a fantastic experience. And he was very generous, and he was saying, "Now, what must I play on this stuff?" And I just thought, this is surreal that Joe Zawinul is asking me, but on the other hand, he was just like thinking, this is an idiom I don't know, a language I don't know. And what should I? So it was an amazing week. We spent 3 or 4 days in Vienna doing this.
Can you give an example, a musical example, what you were playing, which he wanted you to play? Or is it like the South African groups? Yeah.
There's a tune that they did. They do their version of "The Lion Sleeps Tonight." And the way they do it is it's not like harmonically complicated, but it's like we had this thing where we used to go, so I would play that, and then they would sort of turn around and shout at me and say, "Hi, man, you did that all wrong. You did that crazy. That's crazy." Then it's again. Then I go, "Every morning, Zawinul Matambo." And then there'd be this bit of stage business, and then it would go into the groove like. Now I'm just singing what they would sing, but it had this kind of atmosphere and groove, but he wasn't really. It's not the kind of thing which he could learn to do, and of course, the band just kind of picked it up immediately. And Ivan Zawinul, his son, and Tony Zawinul were there. Ivan was his sound guy, and Tony was filming it. And I would love to see some footage of that because it was kind of quite rough and ready. But it was definitely a footnote. And I think it's one of the few occasions. I always thought that if Joe had gone to South Africa and met musicians of his own ability that could realize, he could have done a similar kind of thing in South Africa, mixing his world music vibe as he did, in Central Africa or Senegal, that he did, with Salif Keita and those things. But it wasn't to be. He did come out to a few years later. He came and played at the South African Cape Town Jazz Festival, and that's the only time he went to South Africa.
But he probably didn't have time to really stay and explore the music and all of that.
That's right. Yeah.
Because he was kind of pioneering in putting all these great people together. I mean, Richard Bona started out with him from Cameroon, and then he always had this fusion thing. And we're talking about 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
He was really pioneering there.
Yeah.
Wow, amazing. And what about Sting? You also collaborated with Sting and Dominic Miller.
Well, this is another of these crazy tales where I was playing in a pub in winter, and there were 4 people in the audience. And we were doing, it was with a friend of mine called Dominic Aldis, a really good pianist and singer, very into Bill Evans and Michel Legrand. And so we were doing this gig, and he was at school with Dominic Miller. So he got Dominic to come down to this gig with the keyboard player from Level 42, Mike. Forget his name. Anyway, these two guys came down to the gig of half a dozen people in the audience, and he liked the harmonica. Dominic Miller did, and he said, "I want you to come and play on my album." So he has an album called. It was like his second album, and so I did a couple of tracks on those, and then Sting heard them, and Sting said, "Get hold of this guy to come and do some gigs with us," you know. And at the time, Stevie Wonder had recorded the title track of Sting's album Brand New Day. And so Sting needed to promote it, but he couldn't get Stevie Wonder out. So I had, so he called me, and I went to Paris and I auditioned with him. And then I did this TV show with him, where only they were the band were miming to a backing track, but Sting and I were playing live, and I had to learn this harmonica solo. I don't know if I can play it now, but. So they gave me the original tape of Stevie playing that, mixed very high, to learn. And what was amazing is that, it's in a key of B, and it's the hardest key to play in. But Stevie, being Stevie, found all the really cool licks to play on this. And I think the Toots would have really appreciated, because in the key of B, you've got like. You've got lots of really natural, funky things. And when you listen to Stevie's solo on that, it's just crazy. It's the perfect, it's perfect vehicle. You've got the little harmonica intro, then you've got these hip little licks behind what Sting is doing, and then you've got an 8-bar solo, which Stevie does, which is like killer. It's just killer. And, when I heard this, I thought, it's just like a poisoned chalice, because how can you imitate that? And the crazy thing, Mike, is that in the same year I'd had this thing with Sting. In the same year I got a gig with Eurythmics doing exactly the same thing, where they were performing There Must Be an Angel, Stevie Wonder harmonica solo. And it's not because they heard that I was working with Sting. It's just that came up as well. My name came up, and you can see these on my Instagram, and I basically shredded the two Stevie Wonder solos. And, and it's great to have done this, but, the next month I went back to playing in restaurants and doing I was normally doing. It didn't lead to a world tour. Maybe if I'd been who knows what they thought, I haven't been called by either of them again,
Back to reality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, I didn't get kicked off the gig. I mean, I did. I mean, and then with Eurythmics, we did 2 gigs. We did the Party in the Park, and we also did a gig on the Greenpeace boat, because they were doing this. This was the peace tour, Eurythmics peace tour in the summer of 1999. And often, what's happened is that it's not enough to be just a harmonica player. You need to have harmonica doubling something else. And so I think Snake Davis, got the tour, and I wasn't super experienced at that, and I think they kind of sensed that maybe,
You never know what's behind. I really at this stage of my career, whatever, I let go of all these things.
Yes,
you never know, things happen. People call you, and then they promise you the world, and then afterwards nothing happens, or you don't expect anything, and then things come up. I'm like, whatever happens or doesn't happen, it's all good.
Yeah. You're right,
because and it doesn't say anything about your musicianship or whatever. There are also so many circumstances. You never know.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm sure that's a tenet of your self-management for musicians, because if you can't, you just don't know what's going to happen. You might get a 6 month tour, or you might be sacked from a 6 month tour, or it's just
Yeah,
weird that.
yeah.
But Mike, I have to tell you one more Toots story, which is that I met Toots and I interviewed him in Leiden in January of 1996. My mum and stepmother were living in The Hague, and she knew that I liked Toots. And she said, "Oh, Toots is doing a gig nearby in Leiden. Why don't you come over and meet him?" And I thought, great, because I'm a writer as well. I've done some journalism and written features and stuff like that. So I got hold of his management, which was Dirk Gotts at the time, and
Yes.
Fila as well.
Fairly, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and they said, yeah, come over and meet him at the Sassenheim Hotel in Leiden. So I went over there, and Toots was expecting to meet like a normal music journalist, not somebody who was a harmonica player. And he was super generous and so interesting. And I just had it was wonderful listening to him. And I have got, I talked about this when we were in Brussels, I think, and we did that. We both contributed to the Toots Memorial thing in May 22 at the
Right.
KBR Museum. But the thing is, it was really great to meet him. So I wrote this little article, and it was printed in a Harmonica magazine and somewhere else. And then a year later, I got called to do a film, and they said, this film called Hard Rain, we've booked Toots Thielemans to do it, but he can't make the first day. Can you come along and do it? And I said, well, I've got no orchestral experience. And they said, no, but don't worry. We've heard your demo. We know. And I had like a little cassette demo, and they said, we like your demo. Come and do it. So I turned up at CTS Studios, and it was like a Buñuel film where you just this nightmare of like dozens of musicians walking in, and I just never been in that situation. And the first cue is the title music with the harmonica playing the theme. And I've got the chart still. It was an F minor, and I looked at it and I thought, my God, I need half an hour in a room with this chart. I've never done anything like this. But they were kind of really supportive, and I made a few attempts to do it and so on. And then Toots turned up. And then Toots and the first thing he said, he hadn't seen me for, he said, Adam, how are you, man? He gives me a big hug. So immediately they're kind of impressed by that Toots knew me. Then Toots had to go at this, and he took a few goes to get it. So they kept me on. Instead, I thought I'm just going to be let go, but they kept me on and as a kind of harmonica consultant in the control room, and they went through the whole week, paying me to be there, and then Toots couldn't do the last day, and then I did a few cues. So on the film Hard Rain, I've got a credit, and I think I'm probably the only harmonica player that shares a harmonica credit on a film with Toots. But again, his sound, Mike, if you listen to in the podcast I did, I took the original track off a CD, and I put it on the footage which I got off the title track, so that you can hear what he's doing. And it is absolutely sublime. And to see him working in a studio, they had these very expensive mics, £3,000 Neumann mics. And he said, just give me an SM57 and a jug of water. I remember him saying that. And he just got his sound. And then the other thing which blew me away was that sometimes he went wrong, like off the chart. And there were all these very like atonal orchestral chords, which you couldn't like relate to roots, fifths, anything like that. And he just played incredible stuff over it. And I just thought, how does he hear that? Because I mean, I've spent a lot of time trying to learn to play on changes, but I have to kind of locate the key, or I use visualize the piano to get around things. But he's so spontaneous. I just think he doesn't need anything except his ears, and that sound and the phrasing and the taste is unbelievable.
Yeah, he had an interesting combination of playing very intuitive, and he was also, of course, he was very knowledgeable. He also played guitar and all of that, and he knew all the he knew everything. But at the same time, he had this intuition, and it always kind of sounded good. You know who has the same? But speaking about South Africa, with his Mbuzo Koza, this is his wonderful Zulu singer I recorded with and played with. And you know, I mean, Mbuzo didn't have any musical like education, but I recorded with him, and I would play any chord, and the more complicated the chord, the more he loved it, and he would sing stuff on that, and it always sounded amazing. Some people have this.
Yeah, yeah. That
That's
album of yours, the Joburg Sessions, is wonderful. It's amazing. And not many people have taken the time and had the stamina to really go to South Africa and engage with South African musicians in the way that you have. And I think that's, you know,
that's how we met, because out of love for South Africa and my love for South Africa. Yeah. Adam, thank you so much for sharing all these beautiful stories.
it's been a great pleasure. I hope I haven't talked too much. Once you get me going, I can't stop. It's like Coltrane, you can't take the saxophone out of his mouth.
Don't you worry. It was such a beautiful talk, and so many beautiful stories. I enjoyed every second of it, and I'm sure the listeners will as well.
Well, Mike, it's a pleasure to talk to you, and you know, I love what you do. I think it's unique, you know, and I just remember driving through France, listening to your album Opera Meets Jazz again and again and again, and you know, I wish you huge success, you know, with your travels. I mean, you're a true world musician, and tireless, and it's hard work, you know.
Yeah.
And I really respect that, and I love that, and I'm sure you've got all kinds of great stories and experiences still to happen.
That's so kind of you. Thank you, Adam. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for listening. If you enjoy my podcast, then please subscribe, leave a rating and a review. Please visit my website, mikedelferro.com, where you also will find links to my other podcast, Self-Management for Musicians. You will also find links to my music and my socials. And of course, please share this podcast with anyone interested. Nothing beats the word of mouth. Thank you.